Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be continuing right where we left off on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One GPU debate and analysis. This would be part 6, and all the information is correct as of 7th of August. So, this is going to be a fairly interesting video because what we're actually going to be discussing here, rather than discussing a lot more on the GPU specifications, because we really hammered home on that on the GCN video. So we're going to be spending a while actually speaking about what the developers themselves are going to be able to do, and then we're going to move on from there. Now, I say that because one thing that's been concerning me with this generation of consoles is just what the developers, the actual games creators, are going to be able to get out of the systems. Now, Sony and Microsoft, especially Sony, have been purposefully very, very crafty and very honest in that they said that they want to make the system as accessible and open as possible. You may remember that in the QuakeCon interview, or should I say speech, that John Carmack was giving, that he was saying that, look, one of the primary things that they're actually focused on is, not changing the code at first, but getting more of what they've already got. So in other words, easier time of porting down the game, better time of actually fitting all the stuff into memory, and just being able to make the experience better for the developer. This isn't an exact quote, but he did say something like that one of the problems is that 90% of the work you've done, you've got the game pretty much finished, you're really happy, and then you realise that it just doesn't fit completely in the console's memory. And he's been very vocal, and certainly not just him. There have been various developers who have been very vocal that, look, the consoles just didn't have enough resources, particularly RAM. And so, you're going from just a few hundred megabytes of RAM on the PS3, had just under 200 megabytes of RAM for main system memory, not GPU memory. And you're moving on to something like, 4 or 5 gigs. And that's a substantial increase, and that's going to make games development a hell of a lot easier in terms of our platform. But one of the things that a lot of the people are really focused upon right now on the PS4 is the difference in GPU specifications, and that's of course one of the primary focus of this video or this video series. And it turns out that it's not a super easy thing to really quantify. Now, we do know that in theory the Xbox One has a little bit less than 50% less power. This is obviously due to the extra GCN cores. However, fortunately for the Xbox One, there is that slight GPU upclock, which does help things a little bit and does help to stop there being so much punishment, if you will, on the Xbox. However, there is no doubt about it, there is a significant disparity between the two GPUs in terms of their raw performance. Just over 50 T-flops of disparity, in fact. And that's quite significant. Now, we do know that Sony have said that one of the primary goals they have is for the PlayStation to continue to evolve over time, for the hardware to continue to evolve over time, and that's one of the things that we expect that they're going to do. We expect them to try and reduce the size of the operating system, unlock more basic potential for the developers. And no doubt Microsoft will try to follow the same suit, who knows exactly what both companies have, somewhat planned in their foreseeable future, 2-3 years down the line. However, let's have a quick look at what people assume. I think some people, I don't mean all, but some people have this vision that PlayStation 4 games are going to be like a completely different, separate beast to that of the Xbox One. And they expect them to look amazingly different or whatever. Most likely this isn't going to be the case. I kind of touched upon this in other videos before, but it's most likely that this is really not going to be the case. Most likely, we're going to be seeing titles on the PS4 and Xbox One having primarily resolution differences. So, for example, the PS4 may run at 1080p, so 1920 by 1080, and the Xbox One version may run at like just a smidgen under, or it might run at like 1600 by 900, for example. We might also see slight changes in the overall quality. For example, if you're used to playing on PC games, you'll know the older graphical settings that you can go into, and you can change the shadow quality or the texture quality or the model quality or whatever. And there's no doubt about it that games now are built to be a lot more scalable. In other words, they can it's a lot easier basically for them to simply scale back on at a certain level of detail than what it used to be. And game engines now are actually designed to run on a much more diverse range of kit compared to what they used to be. Now some game engines can actually go on mobile cell phones, for example, all the way up to the most powerful of PCs. And so that's a lot of scalable power. However, there are a few things outside of the graphics that do worry me about both consoles. One of the primary things that does really concern me, particularly in regard to the PlayStation, is the compute functionality of the GPUs. I say this because I wonder, and this is primarily aimed at developers who are going to be creating cross-platform titles. I do wonder how many developers are going to really push compute even down the line. I understand that at the start it's going to be very difficult for studios to simply, jump on the bandwagon because, as John Carmack has said, and it makes sense, no one is just going to shift delete millions of lines of code. It's just not going to happen. It's just not feasible. Games development now is already so gosh darn expensive. I mean, it's prohibitively expensive. There was another quote, I don't remember the person's name, but it was someone pretty damn famous in the gaming industry, which makes it even more frustrating. But they pretty much said, it was actually an Xbox developer, I can't remember his name, but it was a recent interview, and he said that, look, when developers are creating a AAA game, they basically have it in their head that, okay, we're going to be spending millions of dollars, and we're not going to get a penny back until the game ships, and then we just got to hope the game does well. In short, you're basically gambling, you're doing market analysis, assuming that there's a good market for the game, and then you release it. And that's why there are so many different controversies in gaming right now in terms of like female leads and, very tired formulas in games and goodness knows what else, which was completely and utterly out of the scope of this video. But suffice to say, gaming is becoming a lot more expensive. Therefore, that's one of the primary reasons that you start getting these engines which, slowly change over time, rather than a new engine just being created specifically for a game, which obviously back in the days, that used to be a lot more common. Obviously, to a degree, they used to recycle engines. For example, the original Quake or Quake 2 engine was used quite a bit. I mean, even Half-Life 1 was a kind of a Quake 1.5 engine. It was actually a Quake 1 engine, but had some elements of Quake 2, mostly the netcode and a few other bits and pieces, as it turns out. And then for Half-Life 2, of course, Valve decided to create their own engine entirely. But the problem is, most of the time, this is not the case, and they're not just going to delete their, millions of lines of code, especially if they're developing a cross-platform game. This is particularly true on this cross-generation era, where developers have to design games for the Wii U, the PS3, the Xbox 360. Bear in mind, they still have the largest install base, and they're going to have the largest install base for a while. And then, of course, the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One are going to become more and more prolific in the hearts and, more importantly, the living rooms or the bedrooms, whatever, of the gamers. And then, of course, they can slowly start to well, basically phase out the production of the Xbox 360 and PS3 games. So, my point being here, look, it's going to take a while for developers to really start to hammer in the features. My concern, however, is I do wonder how really focused they're going to be on platform-specific stuff. Now, if you're a PC gamer, you'll know this pain pretty damn well. PC gamers, we get better resolution. We get, for example, better texture quality. We get maybe a bit better lighting, whatever. Certain games obviously go better than others. Metro, for example, is a fantastic example of games that do things really well. The Batman series, despite the fact that, say, Arkham City was notoriously delayed and frustratingly slow to implement DX11 features, and even those were a bit bugged on release, but still, the point being that they were there, and people enjoyed them. But the reality of the matter is, we know in our hearts that they could have done a lot better if the game had been ported, or should not say ported, but designed on the PC in mind, and then, the PC hardware. However, there's problems, of course, with designing for really powerful PC hardware. Primarily the fact that most people don't have, really high-end setup. Most people have, setups that are, reasonable, but certainly not, worth a modern setup. Examples of this would be, look at Crysis 1 when it was released, and it was around 2007, I believe, and look at the games that were available on the consoles in 2007, and the disparity is quite significant. I mean, Crysis 1 was incredible. I mean, now it doesn't look that great. Now it's an average-looking game. But to be honest, Crysis 1 to Crysis 3, there's not what I'd consider a generational leap in terms of graphics. It's not like the equivalent of, say, seeing an early game like a 2004 game to, say, 2007. One of the reasons for this is actually spiraling production costs. It becomes so much more expensive to render things. Now, my point being here that I do wonder, in the land of all these really powerful consoles and powerful PCs, just how easy it's going to be for developers to justify, not implement. Implement is a completely different thing to justify the use of this heavy, say, physics. Just for example, let's just ignore all the other functionality of compute and let's just focus on physics, because I'll be here all day listing all the various bits and pieces. You guys know a lot of it by now, AI and goodness knows what else. But let's just, for a moment, forget that stuff and let's just focus on physics. We do know that compute can do really, really, really good physics. And physics that have been implemented in games so far, it's okay. I mean, honestly speaking, it could be better. But one of the reasons they've not been able to is because the GPUs and the processing power behind it, it's just not been there. And when it's not there, they can't really do anything about it. They could just hope for the best and, do the best and create these vague facsimilars thereof. And you can see this. I mean, they added in, say, physics on certain PC ports of titles. For example, Batman and Metro, Mirror's Edge, a couple of other games as well. And yeah, it does look pretty cool. But they are by no means the majority. They are the minority of titles. So, the Xbox One, of course, does have compute functionality. It does still have the Radeon GCN architecture. But we've spoken very heavily about just what some of the key differences between the PS4 architecture and the Xbox One. And so, it still is going to require a certain level of programming from the developers to really make use of this. And we're talking really, really, really well make use of it, or should I say really make use of it in the sense of it's a huge improvement. So I don't necessarily think that all developers are going to go the lazy route. I don't think that we're going to have this situation, however, where the vast majority of Xbox One titles has a ridiculously worse level of physics, for example, or AI, or whatever, than the PlayStation 4 titles. And we are, once again, just to reiterate, talking about cross-platform titles. Developers that are not bound to these shackles of cross-platform development, get, of course, people like Santa Monica and Naughty Dog. Well, they could just do whatever the hell they want. They can fully make use of the power of the PlayStation 4's GPU. And this is actually another issue and concern I've raised in regards to the Xbox developers as well. The cloud is a really, really, really great thing, in theory, for certain tasks. But I wonder just how many developers are really going to want to utilize those, tasks. Because the thing of it is, if you design a game for the cloud, and let's ignore issues with the cloud for a moment, right? So let's ignore latency and whatever else. Let's assume that they're doing tasks that would work fine on the cloud, okay? So let's just assume that for a moment. There are a couple of issues. First, they have to actually code for that. And they have to actually budget the servers in, depending on the agreements and so on. For example, we know that Titanfall, the developers are paying for the servers. They're getting them at a cheap rate, but still, it's still extra cash, right? So it depends, obviously, what features and stuff they're doing on the cloud, blah, blah, blah. But let's assume that let's remove the cost of the equation of renting servers. Let's assume, therefore, that it's just for cloud processing. You've got still a few issues there. One of them is that they actually have to develop the game with the cloud in mind. The second issue that concerns me with this is that you can't produce a game that really relies on the cloud to the point where it's significantly better with it, because then you're basically producing a game that really relies on the single player experience, and therefore you're limiting the market of your game, especially if that game is single player. It's fine if that game is something like Diablo. It's fine if that game is something like, an online focused title. But some people, they just want a single player game, and therefore you're going to really start to make things a bit trickier, because if their internet connection sucks, like for example if they live in an area with bad internet, then those issues start to arise, and it starts to become a really sticky situation for developers, because then the developers themselves are forced to make some choices. I mean, if I had to, for example, just make a pure prediction, and this is by no means a scientific prediction, but it's just a theory, we could be seeing games running on the Xbox One at, say, 30 frames per second at sub 60, 1080p. Or we could be seeing titles on Xbox One with lower texture quality, or lower, overall graphical quality, or less anti-aliasing, or anisotropic filtering, or whatever. I don't think we're going to see a ridiculous, massive difference between Xbox One and PlayStation 4 titles, however. I don't think we're going to start seeing levels of a game looking like 50% better, or whatever. I have heard this being thrown around, bandied about, and I don't really think that's true. If you guys want further evidence of this, you can check out examples of titles like, any of the cross-platform titles on the Xbox One and the PlayStation 2. The Xbox One, I'm talking the original Xbox, should I say, not the Xbox One. The original Xbox. It was significantly more powerful than the PS2. And in some titles actually even offered 720p quite easily. More to the point, the games did look better, they had higher resolution, and generally I'd even prefer to play it on the Xbox One version of games, particularly certain titles, because they just played a bit smoother, they had less drop frames as well. That was a big deal. In other words, there wouldn't be lag or slowdown, simply because the action became too much. The game would run a bit smoother, it would be nicer to play on, and overall I would prefer that experience. but it wasn't to the point where the PS2 version was awful. It wasn't, to the point where the PS2 version was hugely behind. Of course, you did get situations where developers only released games for the Xbox because the Xbox was more powerful, which it should have been. It was a later release, and so you expect a later console to be more powerful. That's just natural. I don't think anyone's really shocked about that. But even so, it wasn't a huge difference. I do, however, have a few concerns in regards to the Xbox One's performance in terms of memory. Now, I am not just talking about the amount of memory here. I'm mostly focused on the ESRAM. Now, I have gone into this a little bit previously, but just how I've been concerned in the past of developers utilizing the compute functionality of the PS2, I do wonder how easy developers are going to find the ESRAM to really utilize and to use properly. Now, from the rumors and the speculations and little tidbits from developers, it actually doesn't seem that bad because, as I've mentioned in another video, the hit rate for the cache, in other words, the chance of it actually having the data that's required, seems pretty high. However, one of the issues that seems to be arising from this, and no doubt we're going to only find this out in 3 years' time, so I guess check back on this space, but one of the issues that, some people have already started to say is, well, this doesn't really leave much flexibility for the code. How is this going to grow over time? Because obviously one of the benefits with the PlayStation 4 is that the code can be used however it wants to be because of its unified architecture. Some people have said that, look, why didn't Microsoft go with like 8 gigs of system memory or whatever and a dedicated GPU or something similar? But that of course wouldn't have really worked with what they were going with either. And so Microsoft were kind of caught in this rock and a hard place. I don't necessarily know if it's going to seriously limit the console. I think only development and time are going to really know about this stuff, because sometimes a technical limitation, once you're given enough time with it, it's actually kind of fine. I mean, the PS3's cell processor was an example of this. Everyone hated it to begin with, and after a while they built up a little bit of tolerance. I mean, they weren't exactly happy and loving it, but they got on with it, and they weren't that bad after a while. They kind of muddled through. Honestly though, I think we're going to see games which look pretty much a little bit better on the PS4. I think we're going to see situations where frame rates are a little bit more stable on the PlayStation 4. But I don't think it's going to be this huge disparity that people are really assuming is going to be. I'm also somewhat curious on just how different games are going to be that have been designed exclusively for the PS4. I think that's going to be quite a big deal. Now, we do know, of course, that both consoles, in terms of raw CPU power, pretty much identical. I'm curious, actually, just how much of a factor that's going to be as well, because the CPU for both consoles is pretty much identical. It's both AMD Jaguar, both have 8 cores, both, as far as we know, are running at 1.6 gigahertz. And so it's going to be quite interesting how designers are going to get around the fact that, of course, on the PlayStation 4 they can start shifting off certain tasks to the GPU. Now, we know that a lot of this stuff is done on C++, and in theory it shouldn't actually be super difficult once developers get the hang of it to start utilizing the GPUs for this stuff. And of course they can do this on the Xbox as well. Nothing is stopping them. It's just that there are those technical limitations. In other words, it is a worse system for compute than the PS4, simply because of the way it was designed, simply because of the changes that Sony basically thrust upon AMD. And AMD have said that it's probably about the most challenging build they've ever done. It's a ridiculously complicated chip when you factor everything in. One small positive for the Xbox is actually the move engines, and they do get to process data basically for free. So they get to basically shift the data around. So it's basically an operation that doesn't require resources from the console. So no GPU/CPU resources to really do that. They're basically fixed move engines, and we've spoken about those a couple of videos back, and I think that's going to be a real positive for the Xbox One. So I think a lot of the performance is really going to come down to those move engines. I think it's really going to have to start to make up some of the ground that they're obviously losing out to on Sony. With all of that said, however, I think the Xbox is going to reasonably well hold its own. And so we're at this point now where I think we've just about covered everything on the topic. So there you have it. I'm probably going to release one more video on this whole thing, which will be likely tomorrow or maybe a day after. And that video will basically go over every last point that we've made. And I'm going to give my final thoughts on everything. But I wanted to do this specific video on games development and just point out to you guys just how important it is for developers themselves to get behind the consoles. I think there has been this air from some people. I'm not pointing at viewers specifically, but it seems to be around the internet right now that the PlayStation 4 is so easy to develop for, and all these magical features are going to suddenly appear in the system because of GDDR5 memory and extra compute engines, and that's not really the case. It still requires the developers to use it. And I know that sounds really obvious, but think about it this way: in these real environments where you've got finite resources, and by finite resources I'm not talking about hardware, I'm not talking about memory, I'm talking about finite resources in terms of real budget, real people who are working in the studio, and a lot more besides. They have to pick priorities. John Carmack himself said that, look, people now cannot be masters of everything. Right now, they actually, this is John's words, and you can check out the interview. It's a pretty long video. I have done a summary of it and breakdown of it on this channel, but I still recommend you do check out the original because it's pretty damn interesting. And he himself said, and I'm pretty much paraphrasing, but this is the gist of it, that you have to just get a game now the best you can do. There are going to be features that you're missing. It's that simple. You can't put everything that you want in because games now are just so complex. So sometimes you're not going to be able to get the best graphics in. Sometimes you're not going to be able to get the shiniest light sourcing in or whatever, because games are becoming so expensive to develop for, and limited budgets and cost of development now is spiraling. And so I think that it's going to become a real thing where developers are going to have to really start picking and choosing some of their battles. I think the compute is definitely going to be a thing of the future. I've already mentioned that I believe that many people, at AMD for example, one of the whole reasons that they went with the SIMD structure, SLIMD, rather than the previous architectures, for example, in the Radeon 6000 series, in other words, the reason that they moved to the GCN architecture, is because they said to themselves, you know what, we know that GPU computing, GPU, is going to become a big thing. They knew it. To be fair, however, they had actually been beaten to the punch, as I'd mentioned already, by NVIDIA. And they'd already done that since the G80 architecture, which was around in like the 8800 range, just for example, which is pretty damn old. I don't exactly remember the date, but that was around like 2008, 2000, something like that. It was a while ago anyway, because I remember actually bloody well owning the card. It was fantastic, by the way. It's a significant upgrade from my card previous. And And so there you have it, and I think it's going to really come down to developers. So I'm going to release one last video on this. That's going to be the next video is going to be complete and utterly it for the series, because to be honest, I'm mentally kind of a bit tired of it now. The next video, I wanted to do it in this video, but this one's already become lengthy, and I don't really want to speak another 30 minutes in this particular video. But the last video is going to be a roundup of all the last points. It's going to be an analysis of everything put together. I'm going to be going over all the hardware specifications of final time, tying up a few things that I have missed, and so they're going to be cleared up in those videos as well. A couple of bits and pieces to do with memory mostly, and a couple of bits and bobs as well, which I can't really do annotations on, so I'm just going to clear up in a final video. And also a little bit of stuff I forgot to mention about API related. So the last video is going to be like my final thoughts, conclusions, analysis, and just clearing up odds and ends that I've missed out. And then this series is going to be over, and I'm going to be really happy because it's in a really long series for me. I don't even know the research times, but let's just say I probably spent about 15-16 hours by now doing research, which is ridiculous. But I'm happy to do it, but at the same time I'm going to be happy it's over. However, for me, the series are not over. I'm going to be doing a GPU series very soon, as well as some CPU stuff. I want to be showing you guys how CPUs actually work, and I'm also going to be showing you guys what various graphics cards options are. I want to be showing stuff like let's just say what upscaling really is, and goodness knows what else. I really do have a lot of stuff in the pipeline, so hopefully you'll be around, and enjoying that. Anyway, some of this video isn't particularly technical. This is one of those parts that I wasn't even going to originally include, but it just didn't really seem right not to, because it felt like, development and the development process of games and developers are really kind of what utilize the GPU. It's like, if you have the best PC in the world, but you don't have an operating system and no one to program it, what's really going on? And all programming is, the skill of programming, is the art of being able to speak to your computer. There's multiple languages to do so. There's C++, there's Visual Basic, there's Python, there's HTML even, but all of them really do the same thing. They interpret what's there and they spit it out, basically using the assets that are provided to them to do so. So in other words, textures or whatever. And so at the end of the day, there's still finite resources. And so I wanted to really speak about that a little bit in this video as well. I'm also doing quite a lot of stuff in the background regarding games development. And I've got some stuff planned that I'm not quite ready to reveal to you guys yet, because it's a bit secret. But I can only assume that you guys are going to love it, because I'm really loving learning it. And I'm going to be showing you guys some really cool stuff in the next, hopefully, couple of months' time. It's going to be pretty awesome. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the stuff. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.